Thank you. Good afternoon. Good to see everyone. Several years ago, I commented in a sermon that the law of God, the Torah, the law of Moses, whatever term you wish to apply to it, was a revelatory device, not a regulatory device. Now, the thought was provocative. It was so provocative that one gentleman called me all the way from New Zealand to talk it over because he wasn't sure what it was I was trying to say. Now, I want to revisit that idea today with hammer and nail in hand, because things like this have a way of coming loose, and we have to go back and revisit them and see what's here. First, I want to make it clear, I take very seriously what Jesus said about the law in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Think not I am come to destroy the law of the prophets." I'm not come to destroy, I'm come to fulfill. We are talking now about Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. "Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one jot, not one tittle shall in any wise pass from the law till all is accomplished." Now, I can't take this to mean that the law was only going to last until Jesus died on the cross, that at that point it was supposed to go away, because if that had been Jesus' intent, he would not have added that phrase, "till heaven and earth pass." That being in there throws the whole thing into a whole new dimension. Until heaven and earth pass, and until everything is finished, everything's accomplished, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law. "Whosoever, therefore, shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever shall do and teach them shall be called great in the kingdom of God." Now, this is important. It's important because there is no one who is going to live a life without breaking, not merely the least of the commandments, but some of the big ones as well. We all know that. I'm looking at a bunch of commandment breakers out here. You've all done it, and you all know you have. You know who you are. Therefore, commandment keeping is not the way to the kingdom of heaven. We all understand that. This is not a role that the law was ever intended to play under any circumstances. That said, the law is a route, a way to greatness. And that is important. He goes on to say, and to finish saying, "I say unto you, except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. For the scribes and the Pharisees, the law was all." Now Jesus, and I think there must have been some jaws dropped when he made this statement, "unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees," who probably were considered as the epitome of righteousness, certainly by themselves, then this was something most people hadn't quite dealt with. The scribes and the Pharisees never understood those things about the law that Jesus was here saying. Now, I want to clear up a source of misunderstanding. The fellow who called from New Zealand couldn't get his mind around the idea that the law was not a regulatory device. After all, didn't it regulate the lives of the Israelites? Well, there are circumstances in which the law does become regulatory. But I'm going to make a statement here. You may want to even write this one down. I'll read it to you twice. I want you to be sure you understand it. The law becomes regulatory in the life of a community that administers the law. In other words, if there is a community that begins to administer the law, then the law does, in that community, become regulatory. The law becomes regulatory in the life of a community that administers the law. Now, we all know, I think we do anyway, that the law pre-existed Moses by a long shot. God, speaking to Isaac, the son of Abraham, in Genesis 26, verse 4, says, "I will make your seed to multiply like the stars of heaven. I'll give unto your seed all these countries, and in your seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Now, this is not just a generalization about some vague idea of law. This is really a complete code of law that includes a charge, commandments, statutes, and laws. It's a system of law. Okay, where is it written down? Well, you don't find it written down anywhere in Genesis, and that's something people oftentimes are confused by. There is no code of law in Genesis, although we know it is there because of incidental references. A lot of you probably have got places and little marginal notes in your Bible that will take you through every instance where the Ten Commandments it was a sin to break them prior to Moses. Why isn't it written down? The answer? It is. It's just written in Exodus, not in Genesis. And I think it's lost on a lot of people that Exodus and Genesis were written about the same time, It's a complete body of a complete documentation of what has happened, both from history and then, of course, in current events in his own life. It's in the book of Exodus. Genesis and Exodus were written in the same generation. But in Abraham's day, the law was a personal thing. From an administrative point of view, it extended no further than one's own family. Abraham was the boss. Were his servants, his kids, his wives, his whatever it was he had. Everybody that was a part of Abraham's household was a part of Abraham's administrative, control where the law of God was concerned. And so Abraham would have administered the law of God for his family. But Abraham could not and need not have enforced the law on his neighbors. There's no indication he ever tried to do that. Only when they became unusually obstreperous and carried off Lot and his families captive after a war with Sodom and Gomorrah did Abraham put together his hired servants. His little small army of his own went out and whipped people and brought Lot and his people back and returned the spoil, minus 10%, to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. So he could do it, but he had no obligation to do it. For him, the law of God was a personal, familial thing. Now, when Moses went up Mount Sinai and received the law, and when Israel entered into a covenant with God, the law became a part of the administration of the covenant. And so at this point, the law did become, for Israel, a regulatory device. It existed before this. It underlay all of this administration, but the law itself was not the regulator. It was the administration that was the regulator. Moses created a complete administration. You can actually see clearly the three branches of government even then. God is the legislative branch. He wrote the Ten Commandments with his own finger. Moses was not even just a scribe for the Ten Commandments. God wrote those down himself. The rest of the law, he dictated to Moses. Moses wrote it down. So God is the legislator, not Moses. Moses is the executive branch of the system of government. The Levites and judges formed the judicial branch. So you have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial in the Israelite system. In fact, this is true of just about any place you'll ever look in the history of man, that government always involves these, even when the three functions are invested in one man as king. Those three functions are the things that make civil society possible. Now, I don't know how well understood it is that Israel did not always have the same precise administrative structure throughout their history. Do we understand that? Are we aware of that? From the time, and I don't mean just in the breach, I mean even in the obedience to the law, it was not always the same. They had one form of administration in the wilderness. They had another form of administration in the conquest, which was a time of war. And still another in the land, in a time of peace. The method of administration, the way in which judicial matters were carried out, the way in which the executive function was different in these three phases of Israel's history, and for all I know, more than that. The administration in the wilderness was extremely tight. These people had been born in slavery. They had a lot to learn about being free. They had not even been taught ordinary health precautions. They had to be instructed as to what to eat and what not to eat. They had to be instructed to pour the blood on the ground, don't eat the blood. They had to be instructed to dig a latrine outside the camp, and don't relieve yourselves in the camp. I don't want to come through here and find you looking like some third world country. And so it was that the instructions were all given all the way down to a Department of Health, which the priest tended to be. This is what he's doing, by the way, in those aspects of the law where somebody's got a mold beginning to develop in his house. And the priest comes by and the priest looks at it. And if it's a certain kind of mold, he condemns the house and they tear it down. Simple as that. We're getting around to that in East Texas here, I think, with some of our mold problems. But, he was the Department of Public Health. He's the guy who, in Israelites, would go down to this Chinese restaurant down here and shut them down because they were cooking in the parking lot, which happened here in Tyler. Not a Levite who did so, but a health department did, and that's what Levites did. The administration at the time of conquest was extremely disciplined because they were fighting a war. And you don't have the same structure of administration in wartime that you have in peacetime. I hadn't really realized until I read a book recently that in the early days of the First World War, that the Constitution in England was suspended entirely. All property was declared the property of the Crown. And if, for example, they wanted to build a runway right down your best pasture, they showed up, handed you some papers. There was no court you could go to. There was no place to go. The king had taken your property, and they were going to build an airport on it, which they did. They could take your house to be used as a billet for soldiers. They could do anything they wanted with your property, and just about anything they wanted to do with you. And what's really interesting is The people were 100% behind it, all the way down to the man selling fish off a wheelbarrow. They all were completely behind what they were doing. You recall them interning the Japanese here in World War II. That was just one of many things that were done that Roosevelt and his government did because it was wartime. An awful lot of things that you and I are used to now in peacetime, you can't afford in wartime. So Israel had a different administrative structure during the conquest from what they had later on. And if you'll read carefully in the pages of the Bible, you'll see these developments as they take place. The administration of the land in the land was much looser. It was more voluntary, as it would be with a nation at peace. Every man sat under his own vine and under his own fig tree. Every man administered his own family. And if he didn't have any problems with his neighbor down the road, there was nothing to administer between the two of those fellows. There was a judiciary if they had to have it, but for the most part, every man paddled his own canoe as well as his own children. So this is the time of the book of Judges leading up to the time of the monarchy, a time when men actually lived more like Abraham than at any time from the Exodus from Egypt until that day. They were back to living, administering their own family, handling their own, dealing with their own problems, and sorting them out with their neighbor if they had to, and if they absolutely had to, they could take it to some judges. Now, there are some specific judgments as to how to keep the law. They varied in these times, but the underlying law never went away. There was a time, for example, when they offered sacrifices in various places. They offered here, there, and around. You see little indications of this early in their history. Later on, you suddenly find, wait a minute, all sacrifices now have to be offered at the tabernacle. We can't offer them under every tree or on every rock or wherever we see. What happened? Well, there was a change brought about by the administration, and it was because of the pressure from paganism. And it's really interesting how that an awful lot of the things that we do believe that are right and good, we tend to drift away from them until they're challenged. And it's in the challenging process oftentimes that we become reaffirmed in what we believe and what we're going to practice. We're built that way. We have to have sometimes a challenge given to us before we really tie these things down. Well, it was the challenge of paganism coming in from all around them that created the situation where all sacrifice was centralized at the tabernacle. You're probably aware of the fact that in its origins, the Passover lamb was killed at every man's house or every 2 or 3 houses, wherever they wanted to do it. And you're also aware that there was a time later when they didn't do that anymore. All Passover lambs were sacrificed at the temple. And we'd probably have a hard time trying to find the place, the instruction where that took place. And the chances are it was one of those administrative things that was done with full authority of God when it was done. There was, as I said, a judiciary in Moses' administration. And the illustration of it, the really clear statement of it, is in Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter. I often cite this, and I'll go through it with you again, because I think that this is a scripture you need to know, needs to be hanging in the back of your mind, because it becomes very relevant later. Deuteronomy 17, verse 8. If there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within your gates. This is the beginning of tort law. Something has happened. Somebody has done something that's injured somebody else. And now we've got a controversy and we haven't been able to agree on this. You will get up, you'll go to the place which the Lord your God shall choose. You shall come to the priests, the Levites, and unto the judge that shall be in those days, and inquire, and they will show you the sentence of judgment. Now note the ambiguity in this as to who's going to do the judging. It's the priests, the Levites, or the judge that's in those days. The expression in those days tells us that as time goes by, exactly who you go to and where you go might vary depending upon circumstances, upon the wars being fought, upon the economy, upon droughts and rains. Who knows where you'll have to go? Who knows who the people will be? But there will be a system of judges that you can go to at all times to settle matters of tort law. And you shall do according to the sentence which they of that place of the Lord shall choose, shall show you, and you shall observe to do all that they inform you. And this is interesting. According to the sentence of the law which they will teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, you shall do. In other words, they didn't invent these things. They didn't come up with whole new ideas. They didn't find things in the law that weren't there. Their task was simply to hear you out, consider the law, teach you what the law says to do, and render a judgment on it. Now, I think most of us who've tried to keep the law in our lives are aware of the fact that there are going to be a lot of judgment calls in our lives dealing with the law of God. What actually constitutes work on the Sabbath? What's permissible on the Sabbath? What actually constitutes lying? What actually constitutes stealing? What type of taking things away from your employer, for example, might be perfectly acceptable, and what kind of things emphatically are not acceptable? These things are so variant that we can sit around discussing by the hour like a bunch of rabbis, deciding, could we do this or could we do that? And what does the law say about this? Actually, that's a good thing for us to do, because in the process we are learning the ways of God and what God's values are. Anyway, you shall do what they tell you. You shall not decline from the sentence they shall show you to the right hand or to the left. What's that saying? It is saying that the decision of the judges is binding. It becomes the law of the land, and you are expected to do it. And it will also tend to be precedent for any other case like it that comes down the pike in the years ahead. You didn't have to come in the first place, but now that you're here, you got to accept the judgment. That's why Jesus said, and why I think it's a wise thing to this day, if you got to disagree with your neighbor, try to settle that thing out of court, because you have no idea what's going to happen when you get in that court with a jury of 12 people or 6, as the case may be. Now, this is crucial in the idea of binding and loosing, what happens right here, because it will become that way later when you get to the New Testament and start talking about this issue again. The whole principle of a judiciary that makes a decision that they teach you out of the law. It's not something new that they create. They're not legislators. They are teaching you what the law says, making a decision as to the application of the law to your situation, and it's binding legally. The man that will do presumptuously and will not listen, not hearken to the priest that stands to minister before the Lord your God, or the judge, even that man shall die, and you shall put away evil from Israel. And all the people shall hear and fear and do no more presumptuously. Now, this is fascinating. This is serious business, because it's just not. There's not merely a monetary penalty in this case. You didn't have to go to the judge in the first place. You went down to that judge. You asked. You got an opinion. Now you're going to go this way instead. You're going to do your own thing anyway. You're going to die, according to this administration, if that's what you do. I have an idea that put an end to an awful lot of, tort law and court cases and lots of other nasty things that might have happened. This isn't talking, by the way, about weakness or carelessness in the way in which you go about things. Presumptuous means arrogantly, with a high-handed attitude. To sin out of weakness, to sin, to make a mistake, to screw up, to do something you kind of knew you shouldn't do. These are things which God forgives, and we'll work our way around them. But that high-handed, presumptuous, deliberate sin is death in the Bible. All this underlines what Jesus said about the authority of the Pharisees, which sometimes gets knocked about and misunderstood. You'll find this in Matthew chapter 23, in that long chapter where he beats up on the Pharisees rather emphatically. He begins this chapter by speaking to the multitude and to his disciples. They're all there together. He said, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but don't do after their works, because they say, and they don't do. Now, when they sat and they judged with the authority of Moses' administration, it was binding. You didn't necessarily have to go up and listen to these people. You didn't have to take your case before them. But in Jewish civil society, even under the Romans, their court was binding. You go, you present your case, they make a decision, you live with the results. This is what Jesus said. They have that authority in this culture, in this society right now. Not that they could abolish the law, only that they could judge within the law and according to the law. Now, you don't have to be real quick to understand somewhere along the line that had to change where the church was concerned. The church could not go on being subject to the law of the Jews, Jewish authorities, and so forth. Matthew 16 is where that takes us. Matthew 16, verse 15. Jesus asked them, he said, who do men say that I'm the Son of Man? Who am I? Who do they say I am? And they ticked off, Elijah, John the Baptist, all kinds of answers they had. And then he says, no, who do you say I am? And Simon Peter answered and said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, well, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. My Father in heaven has let you see this. And I say unto you, you're Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, whatever this authority was, it was not limited to Peter. We'll see that in just a moment. We need to understand that. But this binding and loosing he is talking about here for the church is precisely what he was talking about in Deuteronomy 17 for Israel. In any type of a community of people who are going to be working together, living together, whatever it is they're going to do together, they have got to have an administrative authority. And that administrative authority for the church was not going to be the Pharisees. It was going to be the apostles. It was going to also, though, be the church assembled. After prayer, with the leadership of the Holy Spirit, the church assembled was the authority for binding, loosing, and administering the law of God among his people. Later on, Matthew 18, this is where we begin to realize this is not just Peter. He says in verse 15, if your brother shall trespass against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. If he will not hear you, take one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. Witnesses is an extremely important concept all the way from the beginning to the end of the Bible. And that is of testimony. If somebody's got to actually see this thing, testify to it, so we know what we're dealing with. 2 or 3 witnesses. So every word can be established. If he neglect to hear them, tell it to the church, the assembly. Now the clear implication here is that the church assembled has some administrative authority. Precisely what that is, we'll still have to talk about. But now we have a new covenant. Moses is no longer our administrator. We're not living under the Levites. We're not living under the Pharisees. We're not living under the direction of the priests at the temple. We are now under the direction of Christ, his will expressed through the church, which is his body. This does not mean that the law is abolished. It says nothing whatsoever about abolition of law. We know that the law got moved around in different ways in the Old Testament depending on circumstances. But it was still the underlying law for their civil society. For us, the law has not been abolished. But circumstances have changed. Times have changed. People have changed. Now we have to, in good faith, individually and collectively, think our way through how we are going to keep that law and not toss it aside, not treat it in a cavalier fashion, not attempt to dismiss it, because it is eternal and heaven and earth have not passed. If he then neglects to hear the church, let him be to you as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever you bind on earth, and he's talking about the church, shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And we can't loose the law. All we can do is make certain kinds of decisions that affect us as a community. We can make binding and loosing decisions about what we as a community are going to do. And unless you're going to be high-handed about this, you should go along with what the church has decided it's going to do. The church down the road will decide differently. That is none of your business. It's what our church decides is our business. Now, this is the New Testament in those days authority to do what Deuteronomy 17 says. These are different days. In those days, whatever the judge shall be, that's where you go. We don't go to the Pharisees, we go to the church assembled. And based upon what Paul said, I think even tort law should, if at all possible, come to the church for a decision rather than to the civil court. For nothing else, it won't cost you nearly as much. Our decisions as a church may not be unilateral. That is, no one person can make these decisions. He says, I say to you, if 2 of you will agree as touching anything you shall ask, it shall be done of them of my Father which is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst. Now, this is not really a statement that if 2 of you, let's agree together in prayer, let's both pray for so-and-so to be healed, and if we both agree together in prayer, it has to be done. It's not what this is about. What this is about is the fact you can't make this kind of decision unilaterally. We don't go to one wise man in the church and let him make all these decisions for us. No. This is something, he says, you've got to have at least 2 or 3 before you can make this kind of judgment. It's a more than passing interest then when Paul makes reference to a new and different administration. Now in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 is one of Paul's more difficult sections. I visualize when he wrote 2 Corinthians, for some reason he was in a hurry. He was either in a hurry or he was really upset or he was aggravated or in high dudgeon about something or other. And I visualize Paul walking back and forth, pacing the floor, pouring out the words faster than his I started to use the word for it, it's a scribe. His stenographer could possibly ever get them down. There's a Greek word they use for that, and I can't get my mind around it today, my tongue around it. My mind's there, tongue's not. So he's having a hard time getting it down. You and I then sit down and read this and we think, what? But nevertheless, it's here. He says in 2 Corinthians 3, do we begin again to commend ourselves? Do I need, as some people do, epistles of commendation to you or letters of commendation from you? What he's talking about here is credentials. I don't need to bring credentials to this congregation to tell you who I am. I don't need credentials from you to somebody else. I am who I am. He said, in fact, you people are an epistle written in our hearts and read of all men. These are what he's talking about, are the credentials to establish an administration. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart. Notice, ministered. And by this, the sense of what he's talking about here is what we would call an administration. Administered by us. And such trust have we to Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves. Our sufficiency is of God, who has made us, notice the plural, able administrators of the New Testament. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, in no way is Paul suggesting we're going to start operating with a whole new set of laws. What he's talking about is we're going to look at these laws. We're going to administer these laws according to the Spirit, not according to the letter, because the letter, in many cases, simply won't work. And besides that, it requires the death penalty, and we don't have the right to do that. Our administration is different. We're not going to stone sinners. We're going to save them. This is not a condemnation, by the way, of Moses. In no way is this a put-down of Moses or his administration. This is a different time. This is a different circumstance. This is an in those days circumstance. He then goes on to say, if the administration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, nothing wrong with what Moses said. It was wonderful. But if it was glorious, so glorious that they couldn't even look at his face, even though the glory of his countenance was going to fade away, then how much more shall the administration of the Spirit be more glorious? Don't you realize, as glorious as it was, as wonderful as that first covenant was, that what we now have to administer shines so bright, it pales that into insignificance. Not the law, the administration of the law, the way the law is interpreted, the way the law is applied, what you actually do with it in your lives. As we in this 20th century, for the most part, are free to live like Abraham did. We can administer the law in our own homes, in our own houses, our own lives, our own jobs, our own businesses. Except when it has to do with things that we do together, in which case we have to do them together. There is an administration for the church. How much more then shall the administration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the administration of condemnation is glory, much more does the administration of righteousness exceed in glory. For even that which was made glorious had no glory by this respect, by reason of the glory that excels. Really wandering back and forth across this and repeating himself, a little hard to follow. But he's basically saying very, very simply, what we have is wonderful. It is so wonderful it has paled into insignificance everything they had back then. Times have changed. Circumstances have changed. And now we are going to do it this way. Now he says, seeing we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. Oh, that he really did. And not like Moses, who put a veil over his face, so the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished. Now let's face it. Moses' administration was going to pass. It was here for then. It was wonderful for the time, but it is going to pass. Just like the glory would fade off of Moses' face, so that covenant would fade into darkness. It was glorious in its day, but the new covenant would make it pale. He says, their minds were blinded, for until this day remains the same veil untaken away in the reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. But even to this day, when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. The Pharisees just didn't get it. He says, to this day they don't get it. They don't understand what this is all about. They had created a legalistic structure around the law and were utterly unable to understand what was intended originally in the law. It was the original intent of the law that it be administered in the Spirit. Because it could have been. They could have had judges that exercised mercy, and I'm sure in many cases did. They could have had judges that said, I don't think we really need to execute this particular law in this way at this time because of this. And I have very little doubt that was done. But by the time you got to the scribes and Pharisees, it was all down to letters and dots and tittles and so forth, which is why Jesus had to say what he said. Verse 16. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. What does that mean? Liberty to break the law? Oh, no. Liberty to live the law under your own guidance as far as you can. If you have to have help, you ask, but otherwise you're on your own. We all, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. The Christian has the liberty of Abraham. And Paul makes that connection elsewhere as well. We have the same liberty to live our lives like Abraham lived his. We are not a civil community with daily enforcement of law. You know, you probably expect in this room there are an awful lot of different ideas about how we observe the Sabbath. The church doesn't have the responsibility of policing that. The church doesn't have the responsibility of making rules, saying they all shall. And in this church, none of us will wash more than one cup after dinner or after breakfast on the Sabbath day. Rinsing out your coffee cup's okay, but don't you wash dishes anymore. That's a binding decision of the church. Church does not have that authority. Doesn't need that authority. It is none of the church's business. There are things that are. We'll come to that. Our compliance is personal and voluntary. Now, I want you to understand the word voluntary. There's a lot of people who misunderstand this. When I say whether or not you keep God's law is voluntary, I would think you knew that the first time you stole something. You mean it's voluntary whether you're going to steal it or not steal it. It's voluntary whether you're going to lie or tell the truth. It's voluntary. All the way up and down the line, all these aspects of God's law are voluntary. You need to understand this. Our income tax system in this country is voluntary. Compliance is voluntary. Now, of course, if you don't comply, they will come and take away your bank account. They'll take away your house. If it's bad enough, they'll take away your freedom. But compliance is voluntary. And the truth is, compliance with the law of God is the same way for you. It's voluntary. If you break it, you have a choice. The consequences will come rolling down the hill on you afterward, right away, far off, but they're always there. If you lie, your character goes in the toilet. You commit adultery, your marriage goes down the drain. And so it may go. But you have the right to do these things if you decide. Compliance is voluntary. Now, there's an application of this administrative authority in 1 Corinthians 5. I said I was going to come to this, and here it is. It is reported that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. Now, here we got a problem, because in one sense, I said a little while ago, whether you wash the dishes on the Sabbath or not is none of the church's business. We don't have any concern with that. That's up to you. Well, why is it not the church's business? Why is it the church's business that this fellow was sleeping with his father's wife, assume his stepmother? Well, it's different. It's bringing a disgrace on the name of the church. It's bringing a disgrace on Christ. It's probably having a divisive effect on the church. Paul said, "You are puffed up and have not rather mourned that he that has done this deed might be taken away from among you. For I verily, as absent in body but present in the Lord, have judged already as though I were present concerning him that's done this deed. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when you are gathered together," notice, not unilaterally, I expect you to come together on this, "and my spirit, in the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, to deliver such a one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus." I have no idea what delivering to Satan for the destruction of the flesh means. It doesn't sound very good to me. I would not like it to happen to me for the church to do this. Now, we do know, mercifully, that his spirit was saved. We do know that later on this man did turn around. He did change his life. The record of it is in 2 Corinthians, and how wonderful it was. And the discipline that the church brought to bear on this man changed his life. It was important. May have even saved his life. He says, "You don't understand this. Your glorying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump?" When you as a church start tolerating overt sin in your midst, you are inviting corruption into the church. Therefore, it does become your business as a church. Not unilaterally, not one person over here or one person over there, but all of us together. You take the first steps one-on-one. You take the second step with a couple of witnesses, and you take the third step with all of us here. And that's part of being Christian. It's part of our responsibility as a member of this body, is that we have to be prepared, if it becomes necessary, to exercise some level of discipline in our midst. It doesn't have to do with what you believe. It doesn't have to do with what you think. It has to do with the way you conduct yourself in society, in the world. "Purge out, therefore, the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. Even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us." He says later on in this chapter, in verse 11, "I have written to you not to keep company, if any man who is called a brother, be a fornicator or covetous or an idolater or railer, a drunkard or an extortioner, with such a one know not to eat. Now here's a personal, this is a command. This is an absolute flat outright command from an apostle of Jesus Christ. He said, I've written to you, and I'm laying the law down on this, that if there's a person who is called a brother, we don't have to do this with some people in the world. You know, we couldn't ever go to lunch with anybody. The point simply here is that if you know a brother is doing these things, you don't go to lunch with this person. You don't go to his house for dinner. You don't invite him to your house for dinner. Rather, you rebuke him for what he is doing. And he says, then, what have I do to judge those who are without? Do not you judge those who are within, but them that are without God judges. Therefore, put away from among yourselves that wicked person. There comes a point in time where a church has to act, and we have the authority to do that. So we can see, not only is the law not abolished, neither is administration abolished, but the administration has changed. And it's in this change that a lot of confusion has entered the Christian communities who don't understand what they're dealing with here. They have some kind of vague idea, some of them do, that the law was done away with. No, the law was not done away with. The administration of the law was changed. And here's another thing for you to understand from all that I'm saying. The law is not made more lax by this change in administration. I was reading something by Francis Schaeffer recently, and he made the point that when you strip away the rules, he was talking about man-made rules, you know, where you come in to be a Christian and they'll give you this list of rules. You can't play cards, you can't dance, you can't drink alcoholic beverages. You know, you have all the different kinds of rules. Jews had their rules, you know, all churches seem to find ways of getting them. He said, when you strip away the rules, you do not find a more lax Christianity. You find a faith more demanding, not less. We're not looking for something that's easier. Not looking for something more convenient. Because when you get rid of the rules actually make it possible for us to go further down a wrong road than we ought to go. Because there's no rule against that road. Nobody thought about it. You find when you get these things stripped away, the 10 Commandments are still left. You find love of God and love of neighbor, and you can't, like the Pharisees did, dodge behind your rules, like the Pharisees did with Corban, as they made a rule that would allow them to avoid responsibility that was spelled out by the law. We can't administer the law as Moses did. I wouldn't even want to. But that does not mean we can't apply the law. Just this week I came to understand something that I really had not grasped before. And I'll present you with a small conundrum. When Israel entered the land, they were commanded to drive out or destroy the people, a certain set. Actually, it was 6 tribes that are actually named: Hivites, Canaanites, Hittites, and a few others. You know, that they actually lay them all out. You either drive these people out of the land or you destroy them. Now, at the same time, as you make your way through the law, you'll come across statements like, I, the Lord, love the stranger, therefore you love the stranger. He says, now if a stranger comes along with you and he wants to come to the temple to offer a sacrifice, he can do that. But it must be done according to the same laws that everybody else is doing. There will be one law for the stranger and for him that is born in the land. But the stranger is welcome. Now, how do you reconcile this question of let's get rid of all these pagans, and yet let's welcome in strangers? It's kind of an interesting little conundrum that proposed for us. Here's the problem. In Israel, they were welcome if they were assimilated into the culture. There was one culture for the Israelite and for the person who was, a stranger who came in from outside. Everybody is treated the same way. The problem was, and as I said, I hadn't really quite gotten my mind around this until I began to do some reading this past week about the problem that exists in Europe of the complete failure of some populations to assimilate. If they've come to Germany, the Germans want them to learn German. They want them to learn German history, to become, in effect, Germans. Not necessarily ethnic Germans, but Germans nonetheless. The French wanted the people who were brought in there to become French. And a lot of the immigrants who went into France did just that. They learned French, they learned French culture, they learned the French education and so forth. But there was one group of people who absolutely refused to do it. You already know who I'm talking about. It's the radical Islamic groups that absolutely will not assimilate in Israel. And I hadn't quite got my mind around that to realize that what Israel was told to do was to get rid of a certain set of people for whom it would be impossible with them to coexist. They could never assimilate them, not so much because Israel wouldn't be willing to do so. They were more willing than they should have been. but because those people would not, and that they would dominate, their religion would take over, it would be their God that was in control, and the Israelites would become their servants. That's why God wanted them out of the land. And that brought home to me, in a way, from the law of God, the most fundamental principle of the failure of multiculturalism, which the Germans are just now realizing is a terrible failure. The French are waking up to it also this morning to realize what a terrible failure it is. And in this country, we're still trying to figure it out. And, of course, if you look and read the law says people who won't assimilate with you and obey the laws of the land, the culture of the land, even accepting the religion of the land, are not to be allowed to stay in the land. Real simple principle. In modern terms, Israel was not a multicultural society. They were multi-ethnic. They were even multiracial, which probably bothers a few people, but they were. You can't allow the immigration of people who will not accept your laws, your culture that are there. You just have got to forget them. Now, one of the greatest things that I learned about the Bible from my former church, I learned to love the law of God. And I never really quite understood that in my former life as a Christian. I believed in Jesus. I would take, the Lord's Supper. I believed I was a sinner, although I had a rather vague idea about what sin was. Nevertheless, I knew I was a sinner. I knew I needed to be forgiven. But I had not really come to understand or to grasp what the law of God was all about. And there is this 119th Psalm, which I commend to you, to take the time someday, put your feet up, get a cup of coffee, sit there and read it carefully and absorb the attitude of the man who wrote it. No, not just the words, but the spirit of the person who wrote this psalm. Because I identified finally, long last in my life, with what he said when he said in the 119th Psalm, verse 89, "Forever, O Lord, your word is established in the heaven. Your faithfulness to all generations. You have established the earth, and it abides. They continue today according to your ordinances. For everything is your servant. Unless your law had been my delight, then I would have perished in my affliction." Oh, and the bad things start coming down around my head. If it hadn't been for your law, I'd have given up. Psalm 119, verse 97. "Oh, how I love your law. It's my meditation all the day. You, through your commandments, have made me wiser than my enemies." I've always got enemies, he said, but I have more understanding than my teachers. Why? Because your testimonies are my meditation. I really hate to presume to advise France on what to do about their multi-ethnic problem, but it comes right down to it. I can claim a wisdom. I have more wisdom than a lot of the talking heads on television. Why do I have that? Because I keep your precepts. I have refrained my feet from every evil way that I might keep your word. I have not departed from your judgments, for you have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through your precepts I get understanding. Therefore I hate every false way. So the law is given as a light to our feet, a lamp to our feet, a light to our path, to help us to understand and to see where things are so we don't fall down and hurt ourselves. It isn't shackles and chains. It's not given to control our lives. It's given to us to make our lives work.